When visiting certain old monastic sites in South Kerry and elsewhere in Ireland, you cannot help but notice a large number of small stones jutting out of the earth. These are probably the most obvious sign that the site in question has been reused as a Cillín. While many people know little about them, Cillíní are one of the most common historical monuments in Ireland. Normally poignant and moving, they are also beautiful places. Yet, they are also one of the most overlooked type of monument. In a way, this might be because they are seen as something very simple, the reuse of a place that had been sacred in the past to bury small children and outsiders. While this is true, the very act of making or using a Cillín is also something very subversive, as it involves a challenge to both secular and religious authority. Also known as ceallunach or cealltrach, Cillíní are usually regarded as burial places for unbaptised children. While this may have been their main use, others were buried there, such as suicides, those who were excommunicated, outsiders, bodies washed up by the sea, illegitimate children, children of those too poor to afford burial, or, more problematically, victims of infanticide. As mentioned, there are numerous Cillíní in Ireland. Around 1,400 have been recorded. 116 of them have been identified in the Iveragh Peninsula. In the latter, the majority seem to be located more in the southern tip of the peninsula, though this may be because it is the least developed region and more Cillíní have survived there. There are, for example, several Cillíní on Valentia, with others being located on nearby islands such as Church Island, Beagnish and Illaunloughan. The wider Skellig coast region also has many, and they can be found in Portmagee, Ballinaskelligs, the Glen and Caherdaniel, just to name a few areas. Indeed, they can be found along the west coast of Ireland and elsewhere. Before examining some Cillíní in greater detail, it's worth to look at why Cillíní developed. Here, I'm drawing on the work of Emer Dennehy and Courtney Munt. The latter is currently finishing a doctorate on Cillíní, while Emer Dennehy has written a number of articles about them. She shows that the origins of Cillíní can be traced back to St. Augustine and his forceful belief in original sin. Augustine emphasized the need for child baptism, since original sin meant that until a child was baptized, and hence cleansed of original sin, they were damned. I do not want to enter into the theology of this. It was a harsh belief, and eventually a belief in purgatory and limbo arose, which softened this theology somewhat. Limbo was a sort of special place for children who died unbaptized, something which must have been relatively common in a poor country like Ireland. Unbaptized children were held to go to limbo rather than be allowed into heaven. They would not suffer, but they would not be in the presence of God. Daily religious practices also emerged which in a way subverted this theology. One such was the practice of Báistí Uirleach, floor baptism, in which a lay person baptized a child thought to be unwell in the hope that they could go straight to heaven. Linked to this belief in purgatory and limbo, there emerged a tradition, said to be based on canon law, that unbaptized children, as well as certain others, could not be buried in sacred ground. In other words, they were excluded from the burial grounds used for the rest of the population. This is where the subversion comes in. In large parts of Ireland, this restriction based on canon law was overcome by using other places as cemeteries, often abandoned monastic settlements. Non-sacred ground was resacralized or made sacred and clandestine cemeteries created. Some sorts of rituals such as prayers would have been involved. However, due to the secretive nature of Cillíní, there are few direct records of this, though there are some reports that only male relatives were involved and that burials took place at night. Cillíní were used for a number of centuries, possibly starting in the 17th century and running in some places till the 20th. The reforms of Vatican II ended the ban on the burial of unbaptized children, thereby ending the need for Cillíní. It's worth noting that the tradition of burial in Cillíní appears to have started in the 17th century, as this is when the first record of one occurs. As research of modernity shows, the first mention of Cillíní is the reuse of an old graveyard in Muff, County Donegal in 1619. It's possible that this emergence of Cillíní at this time is related to the destruction of Gaelic Ireland. It may not be too far-fetched to suggest that the ban on the burial of unbaptised children may not have been strictly enforced by the Gaelic Church, though this is something in need of greater investigation. There were also certain traditions regarding burials in Cillíní. The child would have been buried quickly, often at night, and it appears that only male members of the family took part. It is unsure what rituals were used, certainly not the usual Catholic ones, and due to the secrecy involved, they were rarely recorded. Probably it was something very personal, such as the saying of prayers or a decade of the rosary. Graves were shallow and sometimes were stone-lined. Often the bodies were wrapped in shrouds. In one of the Cillíní graves excavated in Riasc, a stone doll was found. According to Dennehy, this is an exception to the Christian practice of not burying the dead with grave goods. Also in Ireland, it was common for no end stone to be placed in a grave in order to allow the child to grow. Another practice was the placing of white quartz pebbles on or in the grave. And a final tradition that was occasionally found was the inclusion of a cup to let the dead child drink milk in the afterlife. This was referred to as on sale hall. Having looked at Cillíní in general, it is now time to look at some specific Cillíní in South Kerry. One of my favourites is Kildrena in Cool East Valentia. This is a small site that has a great mixture of things. The Cillíní is located within an old monastic site and within an enclosing stone wall, giving it a castle-like appearance. Within this are the ruins of a monastic site, such as huts, a locht, a whole shrine, and an home stone. Scattered around the inside of this enclosure are numerous small stones marking the graves. Unlike other Cillíní, they are easy to see as the site is never overgrown. It faces to the sea and more specifically to the Skelligs. About 100 or 200 metres up the hill from the Cillín is a wedge tomb, giving the site special significance. According to folklore, recorded on the Historic Environment Viewer, an elderly woman was buried here at some stage, possibly at the beginning of the 19th century, if not earlier. About a kilometre away from Kildrena in Fayman West is another Cillín. This is also in an ancient monastic site, but one in much worse condition. Again, the foundations of huts, a shrine and a small oratory can be found, as well as the small stones marking the graves. However, when I went there to film, the grass was very high, making it hard to spot the stones. It too looks out to sea and to the Skelligs. Interestingly, both of these Valentia Cillíní have been blessed within the last 10 years or so. There are plaques with this information at both sites. Another Cillín can be found on Illaunloughan between Portmagee and Valentia. This is one of my favourite sites. It has been restored beautifully and is a very special place to visit. Few people do, though this may be a good thing. When you get there, although you're only 100 metres or so away from the shore, it feels far more. Indeed, it feels like you've fallen out of the world. It is a very tranquil place, somewhere to get away from the stress and hassle of the modern world. Like the two Valentia Cillíní talked about, it is also a monastic site, and contains huts, an oratory, a well, a beautiful locht and book shrine, and the graves of monks or others who lived there once. It was reused after the monastery was abandoned, with the Cillíní being evidence of this. As in Valentia, little headstones provide evidence of the Cillín. In addition, in Illaunloughan there are numerous monks' graves present, while the island was also used as a graveyard in the medieval period and perhaps afterwards. The Cillíní graves tend to be on the western side of the island, especially near the dry stone huts. Making this historical mixture more interesting, Illaunloughan has been excavated. In fact, it's one of the few Cillíní in South Kerry where this has been done. Over 100 burials were found. Most were marked by crude headstones, the little stones found in other Cillíní. Furthermore, most were buried in small wooden coffins. In some cases, some timber had survived. Often this was Scots pine, a timber that was imported into Ireland from the 18th century onwards. Many of the graves were lined with stones and covered with slabs, while the discovery of pins indicates that the bodies were covered with shrouds. Another interesting finding is that there were older children buried there, aged up to 4 years. As Claire Walsh, the archaeologist responsible for the excavation, asked, "Surely these would have been baptised, making their burial in a Cillín somewhat odd. However, it is possible to bring in here the work of Dennehy, who points out that illegitimate children sometimes ended up in Cillíní. Perhaps this was the case in Illaunloughan. Alternatively, it could be that the parents were too poor to bury them elsewhere." Finally, while no grave goods were found, quartz pebbles were, something found in other Cillíní in Iveragh. Another interesting Cillín can be found in Lower. It is once again located in an old monastic settlement. This is about 500 meters above the ring fort of the same name, but getting to it is easier by following the Kerry Way. In this settlement there is an enclosing wall, ruins of hut, and a beautiful carved stone with an interesting cross, as well as numerous little graves. It is best to visit this place in winter, because in summer the bracken and the gorse can obscure everything. A final Cillín of interest is in the Dingle Peninsula in Riasc. As might be guessed, it is in a monastic site. Here, in addition to the ruins of huts and an oratory, several very intricate carved stones, there was also a Cillín. It is a beautiful site, one really worth visiting, but one in which the Cillín is not very evident. In contrast to Illaunloughan, where the Cillín was mostly distinct from the older graves and away from the buildings, the area of settlement used as the Cillín in Riasc was in and around the oratory on the eastern side of the site. Part of this site had been used as a cemetery in the early Christian period. The Cillín graves are not obvious now, as they are not marked by small stones, or at least these have not survived. In fact, the inside of the oratory and buildings are covered in gravel now. In the excavations of Riasc, a large number of Cillín burials were found. On average, these measured 2 meters by 2 meters and were covered with quartz and sea pebbles. Importantly, there were also several smaller graves, measuring just, on average, 0.5 by 0.3 meters. These must have been for newborn babies. There was an unusual find in one of the graves, a small figurine or doll depicting a baby in swaddling clothes and carved from soft stone. Very poignant. Cillín can be found in many other places in Kerry. Indeed, most of the early monastic sites which were abandoned at some stage and did not come to have a medieval church or abbey seem to contain one. Recently, I had the opportunity to visit Kilboonia in the Glen in South Kerry. This is another former monastic site. Until recently, access to it was not permitted and it was totally overgrown. Archaeologists have only been working on it for the last year or so, clearing the bracken and gorse and carrying out emergency preservation work. I suspect when a report comes to be published on it, it will also have been used as a Cillín. Why were abandoned monastic sites so frequently used as Cillíní? The answer is probably due to a need among the population to bury those who died in sacred ground, even if church practice forbade this. Buried by night, without the usual rituals, but with some sort of religious practice, as evidenced, for example, by the white quartz pebbles. These children and other outsiders were buried in sacred ground, even if it was the local population who had made this space holy or sacred, in a subversive transformation of doctrine. Indeed, as can be seen in the blessing of Cillíní and the reburial of bodies found in excavations in traditional cemeteries, it would seem that in their subversion of doctrine, the people were ahead of the church.